Hello everyone and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be unpacking the poem At a Funeral by Brutus. So a little bit about our poet, and understanding the poet is always important in terms of understanding the main themes and the main messages and the context overall of the poem which we are studying. So Brutus was a really interesting man. I would highly recommend that you research him to gain a further understanding of his interesting life. He was a South African anti-apartheid activist. He lived between 1924 and 2009. He was a teacher, an activist, a poet, and a journalist, and his writings were banned for a number of years because of the fact that they were anti-apartheid. They were centered on anti-apartheid themes, and they criticized the government, and so they were actually censored and banned in South Africa during a period of time. He was jailed for his attempt to have South Africa excluded from the Olympic Games. So during the apartheid era, anti-apartheid activists sought to campaign international bodies such as the United Nations, such as the Olympic Committee, so that they would exclude South Africa from these world events. And in that way, they hoped that the South African government would feel pressurized to change their ways and to reverse the rulings of this oppressive regime. So he was actually jailed for this attempt that to exclude South Africa from the Olympic Games in order to reverse apartheid policies. Let's have a look at our title. The title of this poem is At a Funeral, and it's a pretty straightforward title at first glance. Now, it's important to know that this poem was written in response to a specific event that transpired. Brutus was aware of this African woman, this young woman who had been studying to be a doctor, and during the apartheid era, to become a doctor, even in today's times, is such a big deal, right? And during the apartheid era, if you were an African person who had managed to, become a doctor, this was even a bigger deal, and it signified a lot of sacrifice that you had made yourself and that your family had made. And it's such a tragic story because after receiving her certificate, after receiving her degree and becoming a doctor, this woman actually passed away. And so this is Brutus's reflections as he is standing at her funeral, and she is representative of this lost gift. We're going to see that use of gift later on in the poem, but it's this sort of lost gift to the world. She had so much to offer, so much to bring, and it's such a tragedy that she has died, and Brutus is, at her funeral. There's even more to this title, even though it seems really straightforward, but we spoke about the fact that this is giving us the setting, and to me it's a very, very sincere and authentic poem. It's almost like reading his diary, and he's put as the title At a Funeral, like this is my setting, right? Like you would write in your diary, like at school one day. He's written At a Funeral, and so he's going to give us these reflections on this event. He's giving us the setting to put us in the right perspective, put us in the right headspace. What's interesting is the fact that he does use an indefinite article. The A is an indefinite article, and usually when you use an indefinite article, it shows the lack of specificity, which is a direct contradiction to what we've just said about this being a specific woman who he is mourning. But perhaps this can signify, and we're going to talk about later, how this poem starts off as being something specific, but in my opinion it morphs into this general comment about, anti-apartheid ideals and things like that, and the toll of the struggle on South African people. And so perhaps this A could signify a frequency to the number of funerals that Brutus has attended, which is a very sad, morbid thought. Something else that's important is, from the very first line of this poem, we're going to be pushed into this political context, right? Because anti-apartheid writers are political writers fundamentally, and so something important to know about the history of South Africa is that the apartheid government would ban anti-apartheid movements, right? The ANC, the PAC, they were banned. They were not allowed to come together and talk and plan protests. That was forbidden. And so what happened was is that anti-apartheid activists had to figure out a way to communicate without obviously having banned meetings. I mean, of course they did, but they did have meetings that were not supposed to happen according to the government. But a way that they got around this was at funerals, because at funerals you were allowed to have a large group of people because you were mourning that person. So funerals were actually places of political meetings. This was a place where leaders of the anti-apartheid movements would talk and under the cover of a funeral. So that's just a little bit of context about our title, and it's giving us that understanding of where we're at. And now we can unpack the two stanzas in this poem. Our first stanza is very much specific to the woman who has died, who has inspired this poem. Black, green, and gold at sunset, pageantry and stubbled graves, expectant of eternity. In bride's white, nun's white veils, the nurses gush their bounty of red wine cloaks, frothing the bugled dirge and slopes. Salute, then ponder all this hollow panoply, for one whose gifts the mud devours with our hopes. Such eloquent writing. There's a lot of words in there that are quite complex or not typical in our everyday language, but really beautiful words to convey this message. So we start off black, green, and gold. Black, green, and gold are the colors of the ANC flag, and the ANC was the predominant force in the anti-apartheid movement. So this can signify the fact that this is a funeral of this, it's a funeral of this woman, obviously, that we know based on the context, but that perhaps this has got something to do with, anti-apartheid. She has defied what the apartheid government has said of African people, right? She has gone ahead and has graduated with such a prestigious degree and is on her way to helping so many people. And so she is being honored as almost this military leader, honored as this victim of apartheid, well, not a victim of apartheid, but rather as this leader, this major figure during this time. I think it's also significant that it starts with the color black because of the racial connotation, obviously, that is associated with that, but black, green, and gold are the colors of the ANC. And then we have the use of sunset. This is the time that we're in, and sunset is symbolic of a life ending, just like the day ends, so it's really fitting for a funeral. And then we have a colon, and remember, nothing goes unnoticed in poetry. Every tiny full stop, colon, lack of colon, or lack of full stop are always significant. And so this is really giving us an understanding, indicating that he's going to basically go and give this very firm statement. And what he does is the next word, he says pageantry. And pageantry is an elaborate display of something. It's this big ceremony that you have. And this is significant because if there's so much pageantry, just like we have the black, green, and gold at sunset, this connotes that this is an important member of the apartheid resistance, or this is an important figure in this movement or during this time period who has inspired so many. And so the fact that her funeral is full of pageantry shows the caliber of person that she was. And then we have some enjambment. We are continuing on to the next line without a full stop. And stubbled graves. Stubbled is this bristly growth of grass, right? So the stubbled graves, that's what it means. This grass is growing on top of the graves. And to me, that can signify that perhaps these are recent graves, that the grass is just starting to grow on top of the graves. Maybe these are fighters or activists who have been lost. The fact that it's plural shows how many graves there are, and how this is a moment that perhaps, once again, linking back to that indefinite article, perhaps this is something that happens all too often, this tragedy that strikes. The colon here is used to elaborate, and then we have such an interesting set of words, or such a beautiful and a very tragic way. Expectant of eternity. Notice the alliteration of the E sound there, expectant of eternity. And this alliteration is extremely effective because it emphasizes the sort of the extremity or the length of the eternity. This is a prolonged eternity. It emphasizes the finality of death. Their death will never be reversed. They will be dead forevermore. So a really sort of tragic but beautiful way to say that, expectant of eternity. In brides white, nuns white, veils the nurses gush their bounty of red wine cloaks. So if you think of a bride and you think of a nun, you think of purity, you think of holiness. And this is a direct reference to this woman's death. Remember, she had become a doctor, and so all these nurses have come together at her funeral and pay their respects. And nurses are typically dressed in white. They can also be dressed in red. That's sort of the typical nurse's uniform. And so the fact that you have the brides and the nuns, that imagery of purity and holiness, nurses and doctors do such pure and holy work in the sense that they're saving people's lives. That is sort of the highest calling, right? Or one of the highest calling. Veils is a sense of concealment, and we're going to see that later on as well. This idea of concealment and hiding. So we see it in veils, and we also see it in the next line, cloaks. Quite honestly, these two lines are the lines that have given me sleepless nights in terms of trying to unpack them, because there's a lot of contrasting information here. If you think of the word bounty, the word bounty is actually quite a positive word because it means a reward or a prize, and gush indicates there's a flow of something. So it's almost like there's this flow of this bounty. There's so many of these nurses that have come to pay their respects. But to me, it's slightly strange that it is a positive word. This word bounty, that they've used this positive word, but perhaps it can signify the fact that it's such a beautiful sight to see so many people coming to pay their respects. This red wine cloak, as I said earlier, it's this deep red color. This is what nurses wear. I automatically also thought of blood, but I don't think that has the right connotation in this regard when we're talking about all of these veils, all of these cloaks, all of these nurses coming to pay their respects. Frothing the bugled dirging slopes. Frothing, if something's frothing, it's this overflow of small bubbles. There's a lot of reference to something. There's actually a lot of contradiction. You have lots of words in this poem which are overflowing, like gush and frothing. And later on, we're going to see the words that depict something, the opposite, where there's nothing, where there's a death, where there's this devouring. Bugled. A bugle is an instrument that is synonymous with funerals and memorials. So once again, hinting this is a very important person because a bugle is being played at her funeral. But it's so interesting the way that the poet, he inverts words, or he uses, in inverted commas, the wrong version of the word. So here, instead of saying he hears a bugle, which would be the noun form, he's using the adjective, the bugled. So we can hear this bugle instrument in the background. Dirging slopes. A dirging is a song or a hymn of grief. It's like a lament. And this word slopes is really significant, right? A slope, what does a slope do? It rises and then falls. And so you can almost hear the music through this word slopes. So it's such a beautiful way to depict sound. I think typically we think of, if we're going to depict sound, we need a sound device, but we can see here through the diction that this the diction itself has created or has mimicked the sound for us. We can see the slope of the sound. We can hear the bugle going up and then going down, which almost mimics the way that we start our life and end our life, if we're going to read very much into it. But even just going back a step, it just mimics how the bugle rises and falls. Salute. This salute is really powerful, and it's emphatic because we have that exclamation mark. Remember how punctuation is so important, and so that exclamation mark really emphasizes the power of this command to salute. And this salute could be two things. It could be a sign of respect, right? At like a military funeral, when someone has died, you'll see the rest of the army, they will salute that person. But it could also be a call to action, due to these deaths, due to the tragedy of what's happened, this is a call to action. And that's important in terms of understanding this poem in the context of apartheid, because it's not just a regular funeral. This funeral represents so much, and this woman represents so much. Then ponder all this hollow panoply, for one whose gifts the mud devours with our hopes. So then ponder, and now he's because of called everyone to attention, everyone's being called to action, and then he's actually thinking, and he's going through here, and this reminds me of the diary entry once again. This is such an authentic and sincere poem. He's walking us through how he's thinking. Ponder means consider or think about all this hollow means empty panoply. This is this splendid or extensive display. This is this ostentatious pageantry that's been given to this funeral, that's been piled onto this funeral. For one whose gifts the mud devours. And he says this pageantry is hollow because this is such a tragic event, because that pageantry is not going to reverse the fact that this person, for one, this woman, whose gifts, what do gifts represent? They represent potential. They have such positive connotations. What you could offer to the world. What happens to all these gifts? The mud devours them. And here we have personification. The mud is given the power of a human being to devour something. If you devour something, well, firstly, mud has negative connotations in itself, right? But devours has such powerful negative connotations as well. It's to eat hungrily, to quickly eat, but also to destroy something, right? You can talk about like the fire devours the house. That means the house has completely been engulfed in flames. And so here we can see that the mud devours, such a negative connotation, such a powerful image. It's this hungry mud that has taken away all the gifts, all the potential that this woman offered. And with that, with our hopes. This person had so much to give and had inspired so much hope. This was a person who had defied every expectation, who had made sacrifices, and who was a representation of hope. And now with her death, with her tragic death, that hope has been devoured along with her gifts. So it's a really, really sad lament. And now we move on to the second stanza. Oh, all you frustrate ones, powers tombed in dirt, aborted, not by death, but carrion books of birth, arise. The brassy shout of freedom stirs our earth. Not death, but death's head tyranny scythes our ground, and plots our narrow cells of pain, defeat, and dearth. Better that we should die, than that we should lie down. And to me, stanza 2 represents a bit of a shift, because stanza 1 has been very specific to the specific funeral, and stanza 2, while it is still at the same funeral, this is more of a reflection of the toll of the apartheid, of fighting apartheid, and how these deaths are even more tragic because they're not just deaths, they're deaths within this particular context. We start off with something called apostrophe, and this is not apostrophe like the punctuation mark. Apostrophe is when you are, it's a type of personification, it's more extreme. It's when you address an inanimate object or a concept or someone who has passed on as though they are there, as though they are human. And here the speaker addresses the frustrate ones, meaning the dead people, the graves that he's just passed. He says, oh, which is this interjection with this exclamation. So he's very passionate, we can see this. He says, all you frustrate ones. Remember we spoke about bugled and we said he uses it in the wrong form of the word? Here he uses it again, right? You wouldn't usually say frustrate ones, you'd say frustrated ones. You'd try and put it in an adjectival form. And here he keeps it in the verb form though. And that's significant because what he's doing is he's emphasizing the actions of the people who have passed on, right? This woman who has died, these other young people who have tragically died for their country or for a specific, or even just as a tragedy, these people had action in their lives. They were frustrating the status quo. They were frustrating, this oppression. And so the use of frustrated, the use of the, in inverted commas, the wrong form of the word is significant. It emphasizes the actions of the dead. So he talks to these dead people. He says, "Oh, all you frustrate ones," and then he calls them powers tombed in dirt. Also, what an interesting piece of imagery over here. Powers, these are people who are powerful in their life, who were activists, or who were challenging the norms, or were just living their life in such a positive way. These are powers, and they're tombed in dirt. Now, a tomb can be something really, it can be an almost positive word. If you think about Egypt, you think about like the king's tomb, it's something extremely elaborate. But these graves are not these elaborate marble constructions or pyramid-like structures. They are tombed in dirt. Dirt, negative connotations, just like mud, right? If you think of, you could use dirt and mud, or you could use soil, right? They're all sort of synonyms, but the use of mud and dirt are used negatively because dirt is ill-fitting of those who had all these gifts to offer the world, right? They do not deserve the way that they have been treated. They do not deserve this expectant of eternity, right? They don't deserve this. It is so tragic. This dirt is ill-fitting. Aborted, not by death, but carrying books of birth. Such a powerful line, and this is where we get more philosophical and we get more, he's making a comment about society. Aborted means brought to a premature end. And so obviously this makes sense in the context because this is a young woman who has died. This is a premature ending to her life, right? She's not this old person who has lived their lives. She had so much to still offer the world. And he says that these people, all these graves, were not killed or did not die by death. Notice that death is capitalized, so it's personified as a person, right? That death is a person who is responsible for killing people. A lot of poems do this, and it's something that sometimes we miss out on because it's often been done. But this use of the capital letter and the fact that death is being, it's told that death is not responsible. It's using death, it's personifying death as this person. And they haven't been brought to their premature end by death. And this is significant in two ways. I'll tell you the first way now, and then the second way once we continue on this line. But not by death, because their legacy lives on, right? They continue to live on. They have not been prematurely deceased because their legacy will live on. They'll live forever. But more importantly, but carrying books of birth. What has actually caused their death? What has actually caused their premature demise? Carrion is the decaying flesh of dead animals. What are these books of birth? Notice the alliteration of this very powerful B sound. What are these carrion books of birth? These carrion books of birth are this, if you think about books, you can think about legislation. And these books of birth is talking about past books. And the past books, well, the past system in South Africa during apartheid was a horrific system that defined your movements basically as an African person. As an African person, you were not allowed to be in certain areas at certain times, and if you wanted to be in certain areas, you had to have permission, in inverted commas. You actually had to have a pass book, and this was a major source of anti-apartheid activism because what it essentially did was it really restricted you, right? And it was something that was incredibly meaningful because what the apartheid system attempted to do was to make African people feel as though they were not belonging in their own country because they had to carry a passport everywhere they went. They weren't allowed to be in their own country. So it's a very pertinent sign, and a lot of anti-apartheid resistance involved burning passbooks. Also, if you did not have your passbook with you, you could be arrested very easily by the military or by the police. And so he's saying that it's not actually death that causes these people to be brought to this premature demise, but it's actually the passbook system. Because your race is decided at birth, it's assigned at birth, and it is unchangeable. And once you are assigned a specific race, it's almost like you are restricted from the start. And that has brought about your premature end, not death. You have been restricted from the moment of your birth. Isn't that such a powerful comment to make? these books of birth, that you have been restricted and you have been brought to its premature end, not by death, but by birth itself. Just by the fact of you having been born a specific race or assigned a certain race at birth, now your future is sort of unchangeable. So a really powerful comment here against the apartheid government. I apologize because I have put a rise on that line, on the second line, but actually a rise goes on to the next line. So my apologies there. It is a bit of, in German there's no full stop there, it just goes arise the next line. Arise, exclamation mark, just like salute sort of references that, and another call to action, exclamation mark. The brassy shout of freedom stirs our earth. Brassy or brassy means shiny, and it's a shout. If someone shouts, it's very emotive. Notice the personification of freedom. It's capitalized, but also it's shouting. So that's personification, giving this idea, this concept, such human qualities. And whenever we use personification, it always shows the power of something. So it's showing the power of freedom here. Stirs our earth. The freedom is also stirring the earth, another form of personification. What does it mean, stirs? If you stir something, you're upending the system, right? You're changing the system. You are causing a shift. Our earth is really significant. I think that the use of our shows this sort of nuclear environment, like this is a very South African understanding, or like it's closely related to the speaker. Our earth, like our entire existence. So not maybe the entire world, but our earth, like the earth around us. But also think about a grave where you are disturbing the earth in order to dig the grave. So it works on many levels. Not death. And now he's going to reinforce once again that this demise or the tragedy is death, but it's not all about the death, but death's head tyranny. So death is not the only thing that's responsible here, but death's head tyranny. What do you think that could be? Well, that is definitely the apartheid regime. The apartheid regime was cruel and oppressive. Tyranny means a cruel and oppressive system. And they are death's head. If you just think of the head of something, even, it's like this epitome of evil. And so this death's head has been personified to incorporate or to reference the apartheid government and the apartheid regime and how cruel and oppressive. A scythe is a typical, it's actually an agricultural tool, and it's a tool used for cutting crops, but it is a symbol of death, because death comes and sort of uses this tool to kill people. And this tool is now in the apartheid government's hands, and it's not even meaning death literally, but it's meaning how they have been killing and how they have been destroying so many people's lives. Our ground, once again, that reference to our, this nuclear environment. Also, our is an inclusive pronoun, and so this is significant because it's really including everyone in this argument. So it's showing, as much as this is a authentic and sincere poem, like a personal poem, it's also about the plight of all of the people, all of the South African people suffering under apartheid. Ground is also significant, earth and ground, because it's got to do with graves, but it's also about territory, right? About South Africa. And plots our narrow cells of pain, defeat, and death. Plots. I think plots can be used in two ways here. So firstly, it's a bit of a pun, because a plot can be, a plot of land where you're going to have the grave. But it's talking about death's head tyranny, meaning the apartheid government, who are the epitome of, evilness, and they are plotting. If you plot something, it's intentional. And what are they plotting? They are plotting these narrow. Think about the word narrow. Narrow is confined, it's restricted. These cells of pain. The imagery of cells makes you think of a prison cell, right? Which makes a lot of sense, because the apartheid government imprisoned all these people who were resisting this oppressive regime. So this is polysemic because it can refer to prison cells. And then something else is a bit of a stretch, but I think it's quite an interesting one. It can also refer to like the cells of your body makeup, right? Like we are made up of millions and trillions of cells. And it's almost like they have been, the apartheid government has, really restricted every single cell of your body. Even they have made sure that pain permeates every single cell. So whether it's the prison cell or the cell of your body, it's this idea that pain is in every single cell, because a cell is such a small, tiny thing. And so the fact that he's talking about many cells, and he's talking about each cell has this aspect of pain, defeat, and death, it's such a powerful form of imagery. I find it interesting that there's not a comma here. It's pain, defeat, and death, which is slightly strange to me. If you have any thoughts about why that could be, let me know. Defeat and death, there we have alliteration, that sort of harsh D sound over there, because it's showing this lack of something, right? It's this defeat, it's this deprivation. And death links to the word hollow that we read earlier. It's almost like how apartheid has deprived people of so many things, because the death is like this. You just think of a desert. It's the scarcity. There's nothing. There's a lack of something. There's a lack of empathy. There's a lack of so many things under the apartheid regime. And then we have a colon, and now we're going to get to this very powerful last line, which really emphasizes how we've gone from this very specific, at a specific funeral, to a more general understanding, or this call to action from this funeral. So it's really this authentic reflection that the speaker goes through. And he ends off the poem, "Better that we should die than that we should lie down." So he says it's better to die rather than to give up. Notice the use of we, the inclusive pronoun. It's a sense of unity and solidarity. Lie down symbolizes giving up. Notice there's not even a full stop at the end of this poem, and that can signify that the struggle continues. The struggle is not over, and perhaps his reflections are not over, but ultimately there is still a lot to be fighting for. So a little bit of analysis in terms of the different poetic terminology devices. The structure of the poem, there's a lot of enjambment, and that enjambment, the run-on lines, is effective because it emphasizes the reflective spirit, right? This sincere reflection. He's not being restricted by, typical or conventional punctuation norms. He's just writing from the heart. There are irregular lines. There is no full stop at the end. The first stanza is quite descriptive, and the second stanza is almost a comment on the first stanza, or a comment on society at that present moment. Notice the difference of, or the contradiction, or the combination. We have the overflow versus the hollowness, and there's this overflow of pain and then this hollowness of freedom. The tone of the poem is reflective, contemplative, assertive, impassioned in the second stanza, optimistic in the last line, pensive in the first stanza. So I would use different words to describe the tone in the first verse of the second stanza. The mood in the first stanza is quite disconcerting, it's quite unsettling, and the second stanza, the mood right at the bottom at the end of the poem, is quite uplifting, the last line, but I would say the previous part of the second stanza is still that sort of unsettling, assertive, even angry mood and tone. The themes: death, hope, never giving up, resistance and its consequences, bravery, and apartheid and its injustice and harsh regime, and ultimately tragedy. Please remember that this is just my analysis of the poem. If you have different ideas, then that is great. Poetry is all about interpretation, but the thing is if you do have different ideas, make sure that you know how to justify your ideas. So make sure that you know what you can quote in your answer and how you can actually argue your perspective. That is absolutely critical. So I hope that makes this poem a little bit more easier to understand. It is quite a challenging poem, I'll be the first to say it. So if you have any other, interpretations, please let me know, and make sure that you reference where you're getting that information from in terms of what line of the poem gives you that idea. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that this video was helpful, and I would really appreciate if you'd like and subscribe the video. Thank you so much.